So we've talked about a variety of pathogens so far in this class. We've talked about mechanisms and ways that certain types of bacteria and viruses and parasites gain access to a host and then cause disease through various pathogenic mechanisms. We've talked about virulence factors such as capsules to evade the immune system, but we haven't really talked about the immune system. Right? We've talked about flagella to be able to get into places. We've talked about adhering, and we've talked about dissemination. In dissemination, we talked about sneezing, we've talked about diarrhea, right? So there are a variety of things that we talked about in terms of the pathogen-host connection, but what we haven't done yet is talked explicitly about the immune system, and that's what we're going to do. So the immune system is very complex. For this class, we're only going to talk about just really a few key components, although it'll seem like a lot, right? But it really is a lot more complex that we're going to talk about. And there are two general kind of classifications that we put the different components of immunity in. And that is innate immunity and adaptive immunity. And innate immunity is also called non-specific immunity, and adaptive immunity is also called specific immunity. So innate immunity are things like the skin, various cells, chemicals, things that are very general and help protect us from a wide variety of pathogens. Whereas the adaptive immunity or the specific immunity, that's where we start talking about antibodies and B cells and T cells. Okay, so the purpose of the remainder of this lecture is innate immunity. So we'll just kind of wrap our heads around that. We'll talk about a variety of specifics and then specific immunity, which is also called adaptive immunity, will be for another time. So let's go ahead and look at this and get into this slide set. So let's talk about innate immunity. And so this first slide shows us just a variety of topics that we'll be talking about, and that is how the skin protects us, and this is a scanning electron micrograph of skin cells of our epidermis. We will be looking at how we have cells called phagocytes that actually physically eat pathogens, different types of cells in our bloodstream, such as monocytes and lymphocytes, as well as the inflammation effect and particular aspects about that. And so some of our innate immunity really has to do with specifics about us as a species. And so, for example, we are at a very specific temperature. Some microbes are very well adapted to our 37 degrees Celsius. Others, they need a colder environment, right? pH as well. So different organisms have different temperatures, pH requirements. We've already covered that. And so, for example, bacteria that prefer a specific pH and cannot live in acidic pH would be destroyed by your stomach, for example. Okay? And in terms of chemical receptors, this harkens back to us talking about, for example, influenza. We know that most of the time bird flu cannot infect humans, and even if they do infect humans, they cannot be spread from human to human. And so part of that is the lock and key of the hemagglutinin not being able to bind to a receptor on different species. Okay? And so, however, if things are right from temperature, from pH and chemical receptors, things like that, and they can gain access, then they can cause disease. And so when we look at the first line of defense, what we're talking about are structures, chemicals, and various processes that work. Okay? These include skin and mucous membranes, and reproductive systems, and that is what we are going to get into for this particular chapter. So if we look at some of the systems, so reproductive system, you don't need to know everything in this table, just take my cues from this lecture. Okay, so for example, the vagina has certain bacteria in it which produces acid, which decreases the pH, so a lot of bacteria cannot thrive in the vagina. However, there are some natural, normal microbiota which love that acidity and therefore inhabit the vagina and actually protect the vagina from other bacteria. Okay? Another one is there are iron-binding proteins that sequester iron, and sequester is a fancy word for contain. In other words, the iron is not free, it's protected. It's in like a cage, okay, so the bacteria can't get to it. And so when we look at this, what you need to remember is that for vaginal secretions will protect the iron, right, from the bacteria, and it is acidic and so it will prevent a variety of bacteria from growing there. And if we look down here, for example, prostate secretion, iron-containing binding proteins that sequester iron. So again, iron is key. A lot of bacteria require iron absolutely when they're growing in your body. So if you can keep iron away from them, they're not going to grow. And that's what these iron-binding proteins that sequester iron does. If we look in the cardiovascular system, and we look again, iron is key. So if we take a look at my hands, I'll try to explain this a little bit more in depth. We have iron in the bloodstream that is covered by an iron-binding protein. So if a bacteria comes along and it needs iron to grow, it can't get to the iron because the iron is inside this. Okay? Some bacteria have evolved mechanisms to secrete other molecules which can go inside, pull out the iron, and now the bacteria can grow, multiply, and divide and continue its pathogenesis. Very tricky. So in other words, we evolved proteins to hold iron away from the bacterium over here, but then some bacteria, like Staph aureus, have evolved compounds to secrete, to grab that iron and pull it back. Well, check this out. When that happens, we then turn on genes to produce another protein, which is even stronger, and will then grab the iron from the molecule that the bacteria makes. So it's like this iron tug of war, and whoever keeps the iron essentially wins. Because if the bacteria can continue to get iron, it will be able to grow and divide and multiply and be pathogenic in your body. Okay, so iron is one of the key components that bacteria need to survive that is normally in very limited concentrations in the bloodstream, in the prostate, in vaginal secretions, etc. Okay, so that's the iron story that you need to know. We protect our iron by sequestering it in proteins. Some bacteria cannot get that iron, and so they cannot grow. If they went into your bloodstream, they would just die. Other bacteria, like staph, has evolved to pull that iron away from you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get back to the slide set. And let's continue on. Now, if we look at the digestive system, some of it, just the saliva itself, is a physical moving of the microbes and brings it out. Okay, the thing I want you to know about lysozyme is lysozyme will degrade peptidoglycan. And I'm hoping that sounds familiar because peptidoglycan is, of course, the peptide and sugar structure that forms a big component of the cell wall in bacteria. So your saliva has lysozyme, which means that it can break down bacteria's peptidoglycan, meaning that it will break down its cell wall, and therefore the bacteria will die from osmotic lysis. Okay. Stomach acid, well, acid, a lot of bacteria cannot handle that acid, that low pH, and so they die. And gastroferritin, again, it is another component which binds to iron and sequestering it, making it unavailable for microbial use. Okay, so again, iron and acid are two key components, and also no lysozyme. And then if we look at urine down here, essentially what we see is that urine also has lysozyme, and it is acidic. And so you certainly don't want your bladder being infected with microorganisms, and these are two of the main mechanisms for doing that. So now if we look at the skin right here, and we compare that to the mucous membrane, what we see is that there are a lot of similarities. Okay, so are the cells tightly packed? Yes, and that prevents bacteria from getting between the cells and getting into your body. And then there are various different yes and no's in terms of how they compare. Okay, you don't need to know all of that. You only need to know what we're about to cover. So here we go. So here, this is epidermis. These are dry skin cells. And I don't know, something that I think is very, very cool about this is essentially we shed a half a pound of skin every year. So you know how they say, like, if you've had a mattress for like 15 years, it has a certain number of pounds of skin cells in it? That's what we're talking about. And the reason that's important is because these cells right here, imagine now this red dot that I'm using, imagine if that was a bacterium. And now we've got bacteria all over because bacteria are everywhere. And then this skin sloughs off, right? And essentially is, you know, if this now sloughs off and it's gone, and this sloughs off and it's gone, any of the little bacteria or viruses that were on it are now gone. So when you slough off your skin cells, your dead skin cells, you're also releasing a lot of bacteria and other pathogens that might be on there. And so that's why our epidermis is so important. Now, one thing that you may find very disgusting, a lot of students do, but I love it. Check out this particular type of organism, right? So this particular mite, these are on our skin, and they are eating dead skin cells, and they are eating various pathogens. So actually, we like them, even though that's kind of crazy to think about. We also have dendritic cells in the epidermis, and this is showing, you know, kind of like an amoeba, but this is our own cell. It's got these pseudopods, which are then able to engulf bacteria or yeast, and that's what we're looking at up here, okay? So this phagocyte up here is essentially what we're looking at down here, but just a different version. So there's a lot of different kind of phagocytes, but dendritic cells are in the epidermis, and they're ready, they're waiting when they come across a bacterium or they come across a particular pathogen like this yeast cell, they will degrade it. So in other words, we've got these marauding cells roaming around engulfing potential pathogens. So what we're talking about is our skin. So if we look at this kind of cross diagram over here, right, we've got the epidermis and we've got the dermis. You already know this. The epidermis are tightly packed cells, right, all around here, preventing a lot of bacteria from getting in. Okay? And of course, shedding them, we've already talked about. Dendritic cells, we just talked about that as well. This is just to give you a little bit of picture. Now, dermis is really important in your first line of defense. Let's keep an eye on what we're talking about here, an eye on the prize. And how does the dermis protect us from pathogens? Well, collagen is strong from, the dermis is strong from collagen. And so this dermis, it's very strong, very tight, and it's hard to rip. Yes, you can cut yourself, but by and large, it's very durable, right? And there's also elastin in there, which makes it pliable. Okay, so those are the two major layers, and particularly how they are wrapped into our innate immunity. So our skin isn't just a physical structure, though, right? What we're talking about now are chemicals. And so I love this. So perspiration, right, is great. So we know that sweat glands makes it. Why is it salty? Right? Why is perspiration salty? From an evolutionary perspective, why does that make sense? Because if you perspire a lot, you can lose salt, and then you need to imbibe them again. Well, basically, it dries out cells, and so through a process called osmosis. And so bacteria, a lot of bacteria cannot grow in a salty environment. One that can is staph. Right? Staph can certainly grow in your salty skin. Bactericidins are antimicrobial peptides, which are kind of like antibiotics, but you actually make them and release them in your perspiration. Okay? And so basically there are different kinds. There are some that will kill bacteria and some that will kill fungi. And then lysozyme, we already covered that, right? We know that it is in our saliva. It is also in our perspiration. And now sebum, right, which is from our oil glands, helps keep skin pliable. And this is important because it keeps it less likely to break or tear. So something we should think about, for example, is why is influenza and the common cold mostly during the winter? And typically that is because the air is dry, and so our mucous membranes dry out a bit, and we can get little breaks and tears, and that makes it more susceptible. Now we're talking about the skin on this slide, but that's a natural connection to mucous membranes as well. And then there are acids in our sebum lowering the pH. So hopefully you are following along and writing down a lot of these commonalities that we're seeing, right? Acid prevents. We need salt. We need things to prevent iron from being used by bacteria. Okay, and so mucous membranes, we just talked about why the moisture is important, right? And so one thing that is important is that they also, the epidermis of the mucous membrane also sheds cells continuously. Okay, your gut is rapidly replacing its epidermal cells. One thing that's important though is that the epithelial cells are living until they sloughed off as opposed to the epithelial cells of our skin. Okay, so lysozyme in our tears, we've covered that. So we see how important lysozyme is, right? That's a great question to ask you. And then blinking, the act of blinking, so why is it that when you get something in your eye you blink? Well, it spreads tears and it physically washes the surface of the eye and brings out bacteria, any kind of debris or dirt that's in there. And so if we look at this, this cross-section here, I love this particular image, which I got from an article, which you can download here if you want. And this is showing us that in our sweat glands, look at what we've got in there, right? That is, viruses and bacteria are all up in these sweat glands, all up in these sebaceous glands. And that is why, even after you wash your skin, right? So if you wash your skin completely and get rid of all the bacteria, and then you cover it up with a bandage, over time, bacteria that are residing in your sebaceous glands will be pushed out and they will colonize your skin again. Same thing with the sweat gland. It will recolonize your skin. So you may be saying, wait a second, Dr. Willett, why are we wanting to colonize our skin with bacteria and viruses? Then I'll say, well, remember, normal microbiota, right? Your healthy bacteria, your friends. Remember, you are outnumbered by the different types of microbes on and in you by 10 to 1 in terms of the number of cells. And that's important. These bacteria and viruses that we see here, these are protecting you. They are physically taking up space so that, for example, if another bacterium were to come down and land here, right? And so now we've got these other bacteria that are on your skin. Well, your innate bacteria can outcompete these and prevent them from growing. And so that is why you should love your normal microbiota. I know I love mine. And so that's what we're talking about here. So we will always be populating our bacteria, our skin with new bacteria and viruses because we are actually physically storing them. We're giving them a home. And think about what's in your sebaceous gland, oils that you're making, fatty oils, lots of nutrition. So this is a wonderful place for your bacteria to live. So, and then of course, there's these guys up here, these little mites that you may not like to think about, but hopefully by now you'll look at them and say, yeah, I love them. They're constantly patrolling and eating big things that shouldn't be there. Okay, so the other thing about the bacteria on your skin is they are responsible for the low pH of your skin. So they're producing acid on the surface of the skin, which prevents other bacteria from growing there. And some bacteria will produce vitamins. So anyway, your normal microbiota are a very important component of your first line of defense. Okay, so this is a good place to kind of take a pause for a second and kind of think about what we just talked about. Our first line of defense are these slides that we just covered. And basically what we're talking about are various types of iron sequestering components, producing acid and enzymes which will kill or prevent bacteria from growing. We have physical structures such as skin sloughing off and carrying microbes with it. We have roaming phagocytes which will go around and eat pathogens. We sweat, which has salt, which dry out various microbes. We actually secrete peptides and enzymes which will degrade bacterial components and kill them. We have our own normal microbiota, which we house and gets pushed to the surface, which changes the pH of the surface as well as outcompetes and kills other bacteria.